Welcome at the French Institute, on-site and online. My name is Mathias Rambaud, and I'm the head of the book department. On the occasion of the 150th anniversary of Marcel Proust's birth, let us hear about the life and oeuvre of the man whom Graham Greene called the greatest novelist of the 20th century. Today we are delighted to host Antoine Compagnon, professor at the Collège de France, and Christopher Prendergast from the University of Cambridge, who will discuss the timelessness of the French literary genius. Marcel Proust's work is accessible to the British readers in two different translations. The first one by Scott Moncrieff, which was later revised by Terence Kilmartin, and very beautifully published in this famous collection, Everyman's Library. And this copy was kindly offered to us by Everyman's Library publisher, David Campbell himself, and I thank him for that. And the other one is a collective work by several translators and edited by our guest tonight, Christopher Prendergast, and published by Penguin. Now, you might know that there are fierce debates around these two translations of Proust's work, and those are dangerous waters I shall avoid. I just suggest you read both of them extensively, 2 or 3 times, and then you can make your own mind. In his preface to his edition, Christopher Prendergast mentions the different ways in which Proust's famous incipit, Longtemps je me suis couché de bonne heure, was rendered in English translations. So there is the rather classical version. For a long time, I used to go to bed early. Then the more poetic one, time was when I went to bed early. And someone even jubilantly translated it as, for absolutely bloody ages, it was lights out early. And here again, I'll leave you make up your own mind. Our tribute will be complemented by 2 wonderful film adaptations of In Search of Lost Time, La Captive by Chantal Akerman, which will show in our Ciné Lumière on Saturday and Sunday, and Time Regained by Raoul Ruiz, which will also show on Sunday. And now a few words about our distinguished guests. Antoine Compagnon has been a professor of modern and contemporary French literature at the Collège de France since 2006. He has published several editions of Proust and is the author of many other books, of course, one of them being the remarkable A Summer with Montaigne, published in English translation in 2019 by Europa Éditions. He is a corresponding member of the British Academy and Doctor Honoris Causa of King's College, London. And if Wikipedia is to be trusted, and it is to be trusted because Antoine Compagnon just confirmed that right now, he also taught French literature here at the French Institute in London in a previous life. Christopher Prendergast is Professor Emeritus at the University of Cambridge, Fellow at King's College, Cambridge, and General Editor for the Penguin translation of In Search of Lost Time. He notably wrote Mirages and Mad Beliefs, Proust the Skeptic, published in 2013, and Living and Dying with Marcel Proust, I love this title, to be published in January 2022 by Europa Éditions. And last but not least, let me welcome Louise Ferris, who is a PhD student at the University of Oxford and the living proof that Proust still interests young generations. Louise was kind enough to accept our invitation to chair this conversation, and I thank her for that. And now, Louise, over to you.
Hi, thank you, Mathias. I guess we wanted to start off with Antoine Compagnon. In the conclusion to your book on Proust, Proust entre deux siècles, or Proust kind of between 2 centuries, I like the fact that you mention Nathalie Sarraute, who said in 1956 that Proust was kind of already part of a bygone era and would soon just be remembered as kind of an historical figure more than anything. So I wondered if you could start us off almost 70 years after she said that, when we're still talking about Proust and celebrating his birthday, well, his birth 150 years later, if you could talk about how Proust nonetheless was modern and original and relevant in the 20th century, and how we could still see him as relevant now in the 21st century.
Hello, and thank you for this invitation. The modernity of Proust is a difficult case. Is Proust modern? Is Proust postmodern? Is Proust anti-modern? I wrote a book called The Anti-Moderns. Should Proust be included among this group? Of course, when Gide and the NRF turned down the manuscript of Swann's Way in 1912, they did it because they thought that Proust was not modern enough for the NRF. Proust was on the right bank of the Seine. The right bank was traditional and bourgeois. Modernity was on the left bank of the Seine, where the NRF was established. Then, when Proust was awarded the Prix Goncourt in 1919 for Les Jeunes Filles, there was a polemic which accused Proust of being pre-World War I. Why should a writer who didn't fight during World War I, who was already in his 40s, who knew nothing about the front, the trenches, receive the Prix Goncourt? The world that is described in the Recherche was a pre-World War I, late 19th century world, decadent, representing the fall of the aristocracy. So, was Proust modern? When did he start being modern, start being understood as a modern? Proust was not associated with the movement of high modernism in Anglo-American literature or German literature. In German, the movement that goes from Hofmannsthal to Thomas Mann, Kafka, Hermann Brock. These were the moderns. In English, T.S. Eliot, Joyce, Woolf. Proust was not associated with the groups of the modern. And if you remember, Proust was immediately a classic. When he died in 1922, the issue that the NRF published in January 1923 turned Proust into a classic immediately. Jacques Rivière, the director of the NRF, Albert Thibaudet, the main critic, all wrote about Proust's relationship with classicism, his roots in French classicism, in the tradition of psychology from the classics to Racine, the relationship with Racine, with Sévigné. So when did he become a modern? When did we understand that Proust was a modern? It seems to me that it took a long time, because in the 20s and 30s, after the publication of the last volumes, the posthumous publication of La Prisonnière, Albertine Disparue, Le Temps Retrouvé, Time Regained, Proust went through a purgatory. He wasn't read much in the 1930s and 40s. At that time, the main novelists were Céline, Malraux, Sartre. They were fed up with Proust. Proust was the old world. Proust was an ancient for them. Sartre wrote in the 1930s, now we are rid of Proust. So much before Nathalie Sarraute, nous voici débarrassés de Proust with phenomenology. The idea that we could get rid of Proust. So when did Proust become a modern? it seems to me, not before the 1950s, that there was a new sensitivity to postmodernism. And it started, I think, after World War II, in the early 1950s, with the publication of Jean Santeuil and Contre Sainte-Beuve, the drafts, the manuscripts that Proust had left unfinished and that were published by Bernard de Fallois. And at that point, which also more or less coincided with the death of the witnesses, Proust had been plagued in the 20s and 30s and 40s by the constant publications of souvenirs of his friends, of letters of his friends. So he was like a prisoner of an old world, a prisoner of an old aristocratic and bourgeois world. And it took a while before, in the early to mid 1950s, critics like Georges Bataille, Maurice Blanchot, Butor, the new novelist, would realize that Proust belonged to the moderns. I often remember Robbe-Grillet, the sort of pope of the Nouveau Roman, who always said, when the Nouveau Roman started, we were not understood because literary critics had not yet assimilated Proust. They had not assimilated Proust, and they didn't realize that we were the stage beyond Proust. They were still at Balzac or Zola or naturalism and didn't realize the goal of the new roman. So this is also what Nathalie Sarraute says. She says, we are the next stage. They still have the idea of a literature that is dictated by, determined by progress. There are stages. Proust is after Balzac and Zola. The Nouveau Roman is after Proust. And in a sense, the Nouveau Roman renders Proust obsolete. Proust was a modern, but the Nouveau Roman is beyond Proust. And this is what Nathalie Sarraute says in the 1960s. She is very conscious of that. I mean, of course, Nathalie Sarraute was raised in the high modernist tradition of Virginia Woolf. And so for her, Proust is a contemporary of Virginia Woolf, and now literature has to go beyond Proust. So what can we say today? What can we say today? Can we accept Nathalie Sarraute's verdict that we have gone beyond Proust and that Proust is no longer with us? I think Proust is a man for all seasons. People have, there's a sort of universality of Proust, and each generation finds new themes, new topics of curiosity and interest in Proust. My first reading of Proust was in 1967. In 1967, it was exactly 54 years after the publication of Swann's Way. And now in 2021, we are 57 years after my first reading of Proust. So you see, history goes very fast. Proust, I've been reading Proust for 57 years, which is a long time. And Proust has been present, contemporary, all the time during those 57 years. When I first read Proust in 67, I said Proust was definitely a modern. The first book I read on Proust was Gilles Deleuze's Letton opus called Marcel Proust et les Signes. The first edition, which was very short, which was about 80 pages, then it became a longer book under the title Proust et les Signes. So the introduction to Proust was Gilles Deleuze. So it was a modern Proust. It was definitely a modern Proust. Then, of course, Barthes wrote on Proust in the 70s and 80s. I think that the modernity of Proust in those years was his contemporariness with Freud. Freud was very popular. Freud was available in paperbacks for all the students. So they would read Proust on the one hand and Freud at the same time. Proust would speak about childhood, the theme of childhood, of the let's say the relationship between involuntary memory and dreams and the unconscious. There was this sort of connection which made Proust contemporary. Then probably issues that were not central became central in the acceptance and modernity of Proust. I think that for instance, for a long time, Proust was read even though he was homosexual and Jewish. There was a prejudice against Proust in the 20s, 30s, 40s, perhaps still 50s, because of homosexuality and Jewishness. We cannot ignore that. In France, Proust didn't enter the academic realm, the university, before the 1970s. Nobody worked on Proust, on dissertations on Proust in France in the 50s. And I think one of the reasons was this prejudice. So what is very strange is the sort of inversion. Now we read Proust because he was gay and Jewish. So there's a sort of complete reversal in this modernity of Proust. We read Proust because of what the neurosciences tell us. So we find it's no longer psychoanalysis and Freud, but it's the neurosciences which made Proust modern. So this is we are celebrating in 2021 and 2022 the anniversary of his birth, 150 years, and next year the centennial of his death. And Proust is very present among us. Publications about Proust take place every day. There will be a number of events for this dual centennial, this dual anniversary. There will be exhibitions in Paris. Proust is translated in all languages. And I think the modernity of Proust is the modernity of a writer who has, it's what I call the anti-modern, he is a modern who is not blind about modernity, a modern who has the lucidity and who knows what we lose, the dimension of regret that comes with progress, which makes him a very lucid modern, and this is this lucidity that we appreciate. So Proust is a modern. Nathalie Sarraute was wrong in her verdict in the 1960s when she said that it was time to get rid of Proust and to go beyond Proust. I think I've been too long, but now.
No, thank you very much. I definitely agree that she was wrong. And I think that there's so many points from that, but just talking about how we're still reading him, I think links a lot to what you talk about, Chris, in your upcoming book, Living and Dying with Marcel Proust, when you talk about various different reading experiences and how Proust is very much alive and still being read today. So I wonder if you could talk us through how the readership of Proust has changed through time and how he's still very much being read today.
Yes, well, thank you very much. Please, I can't bring to that question the kind of erudition that Antoine would bring to it. So I'm going to talk, I mean, he knows this stuff inside out, upside down. But I am going to say a few words, if I may. I'm going to pick up on the theme of modernity, or the theme of the modern, the question of Proust and modernity, but not from the point of view of modernism or postmodernism, but in terms of an entirely different concept, which at first sight will seem very bizarrely related to the phenomenon of Marcel Proust. And the concept is something called democracy. And I want to talk about evolving the history of an evolving and expanding Proustian readership from the point of view of this concept, or at least that is where I will eventually end up. Now, in its early forms, the Proust readership was largely, not exclusively, but it was largely the preserve of an educated elite, a social elite, for which, with important exceptions, and there are many such exceptions, but for which reading Proust or claiming to have read him, even when you hadn't, was essentially a form of acquired cultural capital, or Recherche was seen as a source of ready-made epiphanies that you could purchase on the cheap, as so many tokens of being the owner of an exquisitely calibrated soul. At the same time, in this history of the early readership of Proust, there was also, and especially in this country, England, the country of Brexit, let us not forget, there were manifestations of outright hostility, occasionally leavened with a large dose of unadulterated idiocy. And I'll give you just two examples. The first is Evelyn Waugh. Evelyn Waugh, the author of the novel Brideshead Revisited, which is often and absurdly compared with Proust à la Recherche. Here is Waugh writing to his friend Nancy Mitford. I quote, "I am reading Proust the first time, in English of course, and I'm surprised to find him a mental defective. No one warned me of that. He has absolute no sense of time." Now, as we all know, Proust suffered from all manner of illnesses, but dyschronometria certainly wasn't one of them. I mean, the silly things that one could imagine sayable about Marcel Proust, this has to qualify as one of the silliest. And then more recently, I'll just give you one more example, closer to our own time, Germaine Greer, her impressively demented view on this side of the channel of the charms of reading Marcel Proust. I quote, "I'd rather visit a demented relative." Now, what does one do with that kind of attitude? Is something deeply culturally entrenched, and it takes a lot of hard work to take it on, root it out, and confine it to where it properly belongs, the cultural trash can. Now, on the other hand, this is something I'd like to say a little more about. There has been and continues to be a very substantial expansion and widening of Proust readership outside France, I mean. It's what here I intend by the term democratization, what I'm going to call an increasing democratizing of the Proustian reading public. Now, one can only speculate how Proust himself would have felt about this. He has very little to say about democracy, beyond the curious description of medieval Christendom as, I quote, a silent democracy in the article La Mort des Cathédrales. Antoine has spoken about this in one of his Collège de France lectures, a theme that he used to voice his disquiet over the Third Republic's separation of church and state and the whole democratizing project of laïcité. In addition, in Le Temps Retrouvé, Proust, or his narrator, assuming they're the same people, a very controversial topic, of course, but he is dead set against the idea of a popular or a popularized literary culture. So all of this would place Proust in a certain camp on the side of the elite against what I'm here calling the democratizing of literary culture. There is another chapter to the story. This is the Proust who was highly attuned to the new forms of publication and distribution that were so much part of the making of a new public sphere. He was initially extremely keen, although nobody else was, thank God one might say. He was very keen on the idea of publishing the Recherche in installments of feuilleton after the fashion of Eugène Suze's Les Mystères de Paris. He was also very committed to the idea of his novel appearing in cheap editions, that, like the famous yellowbacks of Victorian England, would be sold in railway stations, and so on and so on. And if we run this line of thought through to much later developments in Proust's readership, we are going to find ourselves talking about a whole array of phenomena. For example, I start with this, the young and wonderfully brazen Gallimard advertisement that has a young woman, I should say, reading the Pléiade edition, rather attractive young woman. That, of course, is part of the advertising language, of course, part of its appeal. She's reading the Pléiade edition to the company of an injunction. The text on the advertisement is "Soyez jeunes, lisez la Pléiade." Now, this is straight pitch for a youthful readership, but a youthful readership now actually exists in very, very large numbers. And one of the further or additional manifestations of this development are the numerous Proust reading groups that have sprung up in various places around the world, but above all in the United States, along with what are intriguingly called, I've never quite fathomed this, what it actually means, Antoine might know, what are called Proust support groups. I mean, is this reading groups getting together to read Proust as a form of collective therapy? I just don't know. And along with all that, there are the magnificent solo performances of, for example, the woman Nathalie van der Linden, who is a chef. She cooks in a restaurant in San Francisco, but in her spare time she wanders around the city reading Marcel Proust out loud in subway stations, and moreover in the French original. Or take another example, the story of Radovka from Ljubljana, the secretary who in her spare time has translated the entire Recherche into Slovenian, but who also organizes gatherings of her friends who wish to read aloud from her manuscript. Now, I could go on and on, but I'll stop with those examples and just say just one last set of observations. The story from Slovenia, the Radovka story, is to be found in a book called À la lecture, co-authored by Véronique Aubry and Mathieu Riboulet. Now, the book, I mentioned this book as principally the account of another of Véronique Aubry's project called Proust Lu, which provides us with an entirely new inflection of what it is to read Proust. It is where someone reads a short extract, not only aloud, so to camera and to audio recorder. It's a project Véronique began in 1993. The filming schedule is now somewhere in La Fugitive. You see it's going on for a very long time. It is the most democratic reading project that I have ever come across. It's Véronique with her camera and her recorder traveling all over France and indeed the globe in search of readers from all sorts of locations, backgrounds and métiers. And I have here to confess to being one of them myself, Véronique having found me along with a bunch of other meditating Proustians on the island Bellagio. So I personally would like to salute Véronique as the messenger of what I would call a form of a global Proust leadership as a form of global democracy. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Chris. I think that does demonstrate how widespread Proust still is today. And I think because we're kind of running out of time, I wonder if, Antoine, you could talk a bit about Proust's style and why we would still be fascinated with it, especially because there's this kind of idea that Proust just writes really long sentences. But I wonder if you could explain what the sentences actually do, what his style actually does, whether on the scale of sentences or the structure of the novel more widely, and how that could still really talk to us today, especially when reading it aloud.
First, a few remarks about what Chris just said on the evolution of the readership of Proust. Yes, democratization is obvious, and it has to do with the democratization of higher education. Proust was read in paperbacks. When I read Proust in 1967, it was because he had just been published in a livre de poche, in a paperback. Before that, you had to buy it in the Pléiade, which was expensive for high school students and university students. So the big change is Proust in paperback, is culture in paperback, which is the 60s. But of course, the flip side of that story is some of the aspects that Chris just described, sort of kitsch Proust, the kitsch Proust, which has to do with therapy, the therapeutic Proust, with the marketing that has to do with sort of publicity, etc., that surrounds. Proust is a star, and as a literary star, he is the victim of marketing and publicity and that sort of products. Nevertheless, we should remember that only half of the buyers of Swann's Way buy the second volume, and only half of the buyers of the second volume buy the third volume. So readers of Proust are really the buyers of Guermantes Way, who don't give up. They go to the end. But 3/4 of the buyers of Swann's Way have disappeared at that point. And this relates to the question that you just asked. Proust is not easy reading because of the long sentences. Some of Proust's sentences are very short, but some of his sentences are very long. Proust has a reputation of being difficult. Is this reputation correct, or is it a myth? I know many people who haven't been capable of reading Proust, who have given up after 30 pages or probably even less, who have been lost. The first 30 pages of Swann's Way are difficult for a reader who is accustomed to a realist or a naturalist novel. The reader doesn't know where he or she stands, what this is all about. When he reaches or she reaches the Madeleine, there are some hints of what this is all about. But it's not an easy reading. And you should remember, we have to remember that for the first readers, it was even more complex because they had only the first volume and they had no idea where Proust was going. The first volume was published in 1913, Le Temps Retrouvé, 5 years after Proust's death in 1927. So between 1913 and 1927, readers of Proust had to guess what this was all about. And most of the readers misunderstood what it was about. After the first volume, they said it was an autobiography, and Proust had to say, no, this is not an autobiography. So the reading of Proust initially was a misunderstanding and a misreading. Of course, we can say that all readings are misreadings, but I think that it was very difficult to understand the Recherche at first. Of course, there were some good and some readers who anticipated what it was all about. One was Jacques Rivière, the director of the NRF. Another was Ernst Robert Curtius, the German scholar who published a book on Proust before the end of the publication of the Recherche. So he knew, he understood, but for most readers, it was difficult. So what is my recommendation? My recommendation is to not to linger on each long sentence of Proust. The first reading of Proust can be a reading that will go rather fast and not stop at all the difficulties of understanding the complexities of the syntax of each sentence. In fact, once one gets accustomed to Proust's style and syntax, it gets easier along the way. But the structure of the novel itself, which is also one of your questions, of course, the structure is not obvious and it evolves. So when we read the first pages, we seem to understand that the novel will explore all the bedrooms where the narrator slept all through his life. So the structure is the structure of the memory of the various bedrooms. But then the novel becomes more or less chronological, follows the chronology of his childhood to his adolescence and to his adulthood. So it's more the structure of the bedrooms leads to a more or less chronological progression, which makes it, after all, not that difficult once you understand it. But of course, we also know that the structure, the final structure, was not what Proust had planned at the beginning. Proust always said, I wrote the first page and the last page at the same time. The first word, this is not really true. Proust had some idea of the ending, but the ending was not, let's say, final, even when Proust died. We also should remember that Proust died in 1922. 3 volumes are posthumous, and we cannot be sure that they would be what we read if Proust had lived longer. Given the amount of corrections that Proust made on the typescripts and on the galleys of the first volumes, the last volumes would be very different from what we know. So the posthumous volumes are unfinished, which also makes it more probably difficult to read. At the same time, one should laugh when one reads Proust. I think the people think that Proust is difficult because it's long, the sentences are long, and they don't understand or realize that it is a comical book, that one should laugh all along the way. At this point, now, every morning when I do my exercises, I listen to the recording of Proust, which was made by great actors in the 1990s. And I'm now listening to Un Amour de Swann, Swann's Love. And every page is funny. So probably for a long time also, people didn't realize that Proust was fun. My recommendation is to accept that Proust is fun and to read the novel that way.
Thank you. I wonder if, Chris, you have anything to add to that? Especially in your book, you talk a lot about the kind of short and clipped sentences or non-sentences, incomplete sentences, and so on, as well as the multiple functions of Proust's style. So I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit.
Well, of course, we could talk about the phenomenon in Rhetoricus Parataxis, the very rare short sentence in Proust, which has a very strategically important function. We might come back to that if we've got time. But I would like, if I may, Louise, to play devil's advocate to some of what Antoine was saying and resist his disinvitation, non-invitation, to use his own term, to linger long over the complex, syntactically complex Proustian sentence formation. On the contrary, I think it's absolutely essential to linger for at least 2 reasons, or for reasons that have to do with 2 fundamental functions of Proustian syntax. One is what I call the syntactic loop, the way these sentences keep looping into a whole suite of detours, wanderings, and then eventual returns to the point of departure. And all these looping moves of the sentence form bear a direct relation to the intricate temporality of the novel. I mean, from the very title, from the word go, this is a novel about time, à la recherche du temps perdu. And this is related to the way the novel constantly, it's the syntax of the sentence, constantly flips back from the given time frame of the narrative to an earlier time frame on the back of the constant excavating work of memory. So that's one reason why it is imperative to linger on the Proustian sentence, however difficult it is. Nevertheless, one has to acknowledge with Antoine that the sentence forms are challenging. I mean, they are, as Antoine rightly said, experienced by the reader as a labyrinth in which the reader gets lost. But that would bring me to the second point I want to make, where countering some of what Antoine was proposing. Getting lost is precisely part of the point. That you start at the beginning of the sentence, you get to the end, by the time you've got to the end, you've forgotten the beginning, you have to go back to the beginning, retrace your steps, and read it all over again. This is fundamentally one of the things that Proust is about. It's about losing and finding your way, it's about forgetting and remembering. And what better way to experience that in Proust than inside the syntactic drama of the individual sentence?
Yeah, I said that it's only in a first reading that one shouldn't be shocked by the long sentences. But I agree, of course, with you that one should return to those long sentences. But I don't want readers to be paralyzed and give up because of the length of the sentences. On what you said about the experience of being lost, it is fundamental. One is lost in the first 30 pages of the Recherche, and one should be lost and have no idea of what's going on. Waking up during the night, and the narrator is lost. So the reader experiences the same loss as the narrator, whom we should remember drops a book when he falls asleep on the first page of the novel.
Yeah.
So we are lost as the narrator is lost, and this is a fundamental experience.
Absolutely. But just one last thing, Amélie, is about parataxis, the short sentence. We all talk about the long sentence from a multiplicity of points of view. There are several examples. The famous examples of this example, so-called another term from classical rhetoric, of Anacoluthon, the sentence that's not completed because the speaking subject is blocked. They repress what's coming out of their mouth and they suddenly realize they're going to reveal something they don't want to disclose. And the instance of that in the Recherche, of course, is Albertine about to reveal inadvertently something about her sexual preferences and then stops it there before the sentence finishes, and the narrator goes into a wild paranoid spasm of speculation about what she's getting up to. But the other one also is not from Albertine, but it comes in the last page of the novel. Now, this is a moment that has, ever since I started reading Proust and rereading him, has baffled me, puzzled me, that I continue to play over, and I have nobody else to join in this experience. Here it is. The last page of the Recherche, or nearly the last page, the depths of Albertine, whom I saw sleeping and who was dead. That is not a sentence. It is incomplete. There's something missing. What is missing is the main clause, or the main verb. The depths of Albertine, whom I saw sleeping and who was dead. That is, for me, profoundly enigmatic, almost impenetrably so, and is one of the few examples in the whole of the Recherche of the sentence of an incompleted sentence of that type.
Yes, one has to be careful, as I said, that this part of the Recherche is posthumous, and that Proust would have reworked on those sections. It's the same issue with the name of the narrator, who is called Marcel.
Yes.
Only in passages that Proust might have rewritten if he had gone through the whole process of publication, control the publication. So it's always difficult but you're right. There are short sentences, and there are these elements of parataxis or these interruptions in the case of the Albertine passage. There are things, Proust is long, but there are things that are not said. There is silence also in a long novel.
Yeah, and also, Antoine, you were talking about the comedy in Proust, but Chris, in your book, you mentioned another sentence that would be the candidate for the most moving Proust ever wrote, which would again provide kind of a counter to the idea that every page is a provider of comedy. So I wonder if, did you prepare that passage that you might want to read out as the most moving passage?
Happy to do so, Louise. Yes, for me, it's the most moving sentence in the Recherche. It's not my favourite, but that's another question. But it concerns Maman, and almost anything in the novel that concerns Maman is loaded, emotionally loaded, and it comes in the Venice sequence of La Vive when they go together to visit the baptistry, the San Marco baptistry in Venice, and here is the sentence. It hints at something that has not yet happened, by definition, his mother is with him, and something that will happen, or in a peculiar form of the future, will have happened. And look, he's kind of looking back, but he's not looking back. Is he anticipating something? Yes. Is he retrospecting something? Is he retrospective narrator? Yes. But the something is something that dare not ever speak its name, the actual death of Maman. And here's the sentence. The time has now come for me when, on remembering the baptistry, I cannot remain indifferent to the fact that there was by side, in this cool twilight, a woman clothed in mourning, whose respectful but enthusiastic fervour matched that of the elderly woman who can be seen in Venice in Carpaccio's St. Ursula, and that nothing can ever again remove this red-cheeked, sad-eyed woman in her black veils from the softly lit sanctuary of St. Mark's, where I am certain to find her, because I have reserved a place there in perpetuity alongside the mosaics for her, my mother.
Thank you, Chris. I'm not sure if Antoine, you also prepared a passage to read out.
Well, I didn't have anything to prepare because I've always known which passage was the most moving in the Recherche for me. It's on the second arrival in Baalbek, in Cities of the Plains, Sodom and Gomorrah, when the first night, it also has to do with death, and also has to do with death, not of the mother, but the grandmother. But we know that the grandmother in the Recherche is a representation, is a figuration of Proust's mother. So it also has to do with the death of the mother, represented by the grandmother. If you remember, the narrator arrives in Baalbek, and the first night, he understands long after the fact that his grandmother has died, because he's not able to knock against the wall between their two rooms, and she will not help him undo the laces of his shoes. I just will read you the passage briefly in French. Of course, when it's a passage which is included in Sodom and Gomorrah, Cities of the Plains, so it's the volume that I edited for the Pléiade in the 1980s. And so I had to work repeatedly on the drafts, the manuscript, the typescript, the galleys of this passage. And I never could do it, because whenever I read this passage with Proust's handwriting, I almost started crying. So it's a passage that I could never really work on as an editor and a scholar, because it was too moving. And so this is the French version. Bouleversement de toute ma personne. Dès la première nuit, comme je souffrais d'une crise de fatigue cardiaque, tâchant de dompter ma souffrance, je me baissai avec lenteur et prudence pour me déchausser. Mais à peine eus-je touché le premier bouton de ma bottine, ma poitrine s'enfla, remplie d'une présence inconnue, divine. Des sanglots me secouèrent, des larmes ruisselèrent de mes yeux. L'être qui venait à mon secours, qui me sauvait de la sécheresse de l'âme, était celui qui, plusieurs années auparavant, dans un moment de détresse et de solitude identique, dans un moment où je n'avais plus rien de moi, était entré et qui m'avait rendu à moi-même, car il était plus que moi. Je venais d'apercevoir dans ma mémoire, penché sur ma fatigue, le visage tendre, préoccupé et déçu de ma grand-mère, telle qu'elle avait été ce premier soir d'arrivée, le visage de ma grand-mère, etc. And it goes on for a page. So I checked the English translation. And of course, unfortunately, what I have here is a Scott Moncrief, which I will read to you only the beginning because I was not satisfied with this translation. Complete physical collapse. He translates bouleversement de toute ma personne. And of course, personne is not physical. It's not only the body. And it's not collapse. Bouleversement is a real revolution, upheaval, turmoil. So I wouldn't translate it at all as complete physical collapse. And of course, I'm in Paris here, and I don't have John Sturrock's translation of Sodom and Gomorrah in the new Penguin translation that Chris edited. I'm sure it's not complete physical collapse, and I'm sure it's much better. By the way, when I taught at the French Institute in London in 1980, 1981, John Sturrock was a great journalist at the TLS, and I met him repeatedly at the time. And when he did the translation of Sodom and Gomorrah, he consulted me on a number of passages that he wasn't sure he understood. And unfortunately, I don't have it here to give you his version of Bouleversement de toute ma personne. But Bouleversement de toute ma personne is, for me, the most moving passage in the recherche.
I think I have just found it.
Oh.
A convulsion of my entire being. So
Yeah.
a convulsion of my entire being.
Yes, so it's being. I would have translated it as being and not physical collapse, and not collapse, but I would have said perhaps upheaval, but convulsion is quite good.
It's very good.
Thank you. I think really when we're talking about the relevance of Proust, there's no better way to understand that than simply to read him and hear passages like that and just feel that we should still carry on reading him. I think, is there just enough time for questions from the audience? I'm not sure how I can access them all.
If you have some questions, you can speak up and they will be heard through the microphone here. So no questions from the audience, maybe a conclusive words from our guests. So,
Antoine, toi, moi?
I don't know. There were so many issues that we planned on discussing. So, what is one of the themes that we haven't introduced? What can I say? This is an important anniversary 150 years after Proust's birth, and next year, 100 years after his death. There will be a number of events in Paris. There will be, in fact, 3 Proust exhibitions in Paris to celebrate this anniversary. The first exhibition will be on Proust and Paris at the Musée Carnavalet in the fall of 2021. The second exhibition will be at the Musée d'Art et d'Histoire du Judaïsme, and I am one of the curators of that exhibition, and it will be called Proust du côté de la mer. So it is on the Jewish side of Proust and the Recherche. So this is spring and summer 2022. And the third exhibition will be at the Bibliothèque Nationale. And this will be on, it's called La Fabrique de l'Œuvre at this point. The title is not final, but it will be a promenade through the Recherche and its history, the history of the text, following the different volumes of the text. And I'm also one of the curators of that exhibition. So there will be really a full year with 3 exhibitions in Paris, a number of publications also, but I hope that you will be able to travel to Paris next year, that it will be easier than now, and that everybody will be vaccinated, and that everybody can come and visit these shows in Paris.
Chris, would you like to say a concluding final word?
Yes, well, first of all, just to say to Antoine that I'm going to do my level best to make sure I make all 3 of these shows next year. As for a conclusion, well, Louise, remember in response to your question about the most moving passage, I said the one I read out was, for me, the most moving passage, although I can completely understand why Antoine would find the passage he read the most moving one, but I said it wasn't my favourite. And I'm going to now conclude my favourite is very short. And it comes from the concluding pages of Combray. And this passage is the one that always gets to me. It doesn't move me in the way that the intimations of death and mortality do. It's in a different way. But here it is. When on summer evenings, and this is the translation that begs questions and there'll be all sorts of debates about its relation to the original French, but it's Lydia Davis's from the edition that I edited and I for it. When on summer evenings, the melodious sky growls like a wild animal and everyone grumbles at the storm, it is because of the Meze Église way that I am the only one in ecstasy, inhaling through the noise of the falling rain, the smell of invisible, enduring lilacs. That's it.
Thank you.
Of course, we didn't discuss, many things we didn't discuss. We didn't discuss the poetic aspect of the novel. We discussed more the comic or metaphysical. What is interesting in Proust is that everything is in the novel. That's why it's a reading for everyone. Deals with love, deals with death, deals with the arts, which we haven't mentioned at all. Deals with even democracy, as Chris suggested. So in Proust, there is stuff for everybody.
I think that's definitely true. I don't know if we have time for any more questions.
I mean, there is a question. Oh, sorry. Otherwise, I could add something if that will help.
Yeah, there is a question. So please speak up. It will be heard here.
So I'd like to thank Antoine for reassuring us that Proust is funny and that we don't have to read so closely all the time. There are so many there are so many things that I'd like to ask questions about, but it's, you know, such a big topic. I read a book about the paintings in Proust, which was totally amazing. But the other thing is that the question I want to ask, which I think you can address more easily than the other ones, is the Judaism. Because it's the novel is just so full of Christian references, and I think it's quite obvious that it is about Proust's homosexuality. But how do you say he is engaging with the Judaism?
I don't know if you've heard the lady's question. It's about Judaism in Proust.
That's for you.
Well, I will publish a book next year on this issue. It will come out probably in January 2022. I've been working on the issue of relationship between Proust and his Jewish side for a while, and of course there are many Christian references. Even at the beginning, in the first pages, the baiser du soir, which we haven't mentioned, the baiser du soir in the first pages, the mother's kiss, nightly kiss, is compared to a communion, to a Catholic rite. But of course, Proust's mother was Jewish. She remained Jewish. She didn't convert while the two sons were baptized. And Proust was raised in a family on his mother's side that was not Orthodox, but still quite observant of a number of Jewish rituals. One can only think of the presence of a number of words in Yiddish that were still used in the family and that are alluded to in the novel. So the Jewish culture of Proust's family is present in the novel, can be traced. Those allusions have to be analyzed. And also, one has probably to correct an assumption that is quite often made nowadays, that the description of some of the Jewish characters in the novel show traces of a sort of shame in the mind of Proust, or even traces of anti-Semitism, which has now become a commonplace about among Proust critics and readers. It seems to me that this is an anachronism. That when Proust's novel was published, nobody was making that sort of criticism, and so we have to try to return to the way the first readers were receptive of Proust in terms of the relationship of the novel with Jewish culture. Chris, do you want to add something to that?
No, just to endorse everything that you just said, Antoine. The question of Jewishness in the novel is a vexed and complicated, a very complicated one. It is absurd to describe Proust as an anti-Semite, but there are issues there, the unraveling of which involves all sorts of very delicate interpretive and evaluative procedures. But it's a long, long story. Antoine is going to provide us with it in his forthcoming book. But I have no more to add. Except perhaps one feature, one of the aspects of the Proust lineage, or genealogy rather, of the family history, is the fairly distant but nevertheless real connection through the family chain on the Jewish mother's side to Karl Marx. And that is something that has always made me extremely happy. Because it's so implausible, prima facie, to find Proust and Marx together. Anyway, but that's a frivolous little side note. Voilà.
Matthias, are there any more questions?
Yes, please.
I don't know if they can hear me. Was Proust a snob?
Was Proust the
Yeah,
snob?
go on.
Yes, that's obvious. That's obvious that there was a what can I say? When he was in his early 20s, an ambition to be accepted as a member of Parisian high society, a trait that can also be related to his Jewishness or half Jewishness. The sort of traits that we see both in Swann in the novel and also in Bloch. Bloch as a sort of anti-Swann. But yes, Proust was a snob. There's no doubt.
But he was also a formidable dissector.
Yes.
I mean, that's the key point, surely, about the representation of snobism in Recherche. It's the narrator's dissection of it. And sometimes it's fierce in its exposure, but it's also very funny.
And this is one of the reasons why Gide and the NRF turned down the manuscript of Swann's Way. For them, Proust was a snob.
Yeah. They were both right and wrong.
And when I said that in the 1930s there was a sort of reaction against Proust from the various literary circles, from Céline to Malraux to Sartre, it also had to do with Proust's snobbishness.
Yeah.
So there's a rejection of Proust during those decades.
I had a question. I don't know if anybody else in the audience wants to ask any more questions.
No more questions from here, Louise. Thank you.
I guess I wonder if this could be a concluding question, seeing as we didn't talk about Proust and art, but I wonder if you could kind of explain how he views the status of art in terms of art's ability to provide a form of resurrection after death and longevity, especially because we're talking about him 150 years after his birth, and whether this kind of event would be perhaps something he wouldn't have believed in, or maybe something he might not even endorse in certain ways.
Who goes on that?
The sort of celebration, the sort of celebration and canonization of Proust, that, I mean, what can I say? Proust was ambitious. Proust wanted to succeed. Proust wanted to publish and to become a great writer. He was certainly satisfied of being awarded the Prix Goncourt. He would have been a candidate for the French Academy if he had survived a little longer. Proust would have been an academic. So Proust, it goes back to our first question about modernity. Proust was a bourgeois. And as a bourgeois, he was not a marginal. He wanted to be a major mainstream French writer. I always compare him to Baudelaire or to Manet from that point of view. They are moderns in spite of themselves. They didn't want to be moderns. They didn't want to be marginalized by a bourgeois society. And Baudelaire, it seems to us to be completely ridiculous, was a candidate at the French Academy. Proust would have been one. I'm pretty convinced that Proust would be quite proud of being read still today and being a major French writer. That's what he wanted. He wanted to change the horizon of French literature, and he did.
I wonder if, Chris, you have anything to add? I'm just thinking of the passage with Bergotte's death, so the death of the author in the novel.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, picking up on your introduction of the theme of resurrection, Proust, which reverberates in a number of directions inside the novel, but one of them has to do with the redemptive function of art, question that you raise, that can resurrect us from things that are otherwise lost to us forever. And the way I wrote a whole book called Proust the Skeptic, which was about a discourse, a semi-embedded discourse in Proust, which was bringing skeptical pressure to bear on all the belief systems that are alleged to underpin the book. One of them centered on the idea of the principle of resurrection. And here's one reason why I still hold to this view, the importance of a counter voice. Is this remark by the narrator I think it's at the moment of Bergotte's death in La Prisonnière. Eternal duration, this is from the translation, eternal duration is no more promised to books than it is to men. That is to say, the doctrine of resurrection, when linked to the other concept of timelessness, the two go together. And that word was used at the very beginning of our session this afternoon or this evening. You have to set against that the theme that is underdeveloped to Proust, but of absolutely critical importance, the theme of ultimate apocalypse. And if we're going to talk about Proust for our time, and the epoch of climate change and all the rest of it, one of the places we will turn to is the death of Bergotte. And he dies, and as he lies dying, his body gets colder and colder, and Proust separates this into a whole cosmic vision of planet cold, and the planet going cold as a consequence of the withdrawal of the warmth of the sun from the earth, and a consequence of which is that everything is annihilated. And then in Le Temps Retrouvé, there's another evocation of ultimate apocalypse. Again, for our time, we live in the age of the pandemic or the epidemic, and Proust in the final volume invokes a biological cataclysm in which small organisms become, quote, a mass 1,000,000 times bigger than the sun, at the same time destroying all the oxygen and the other substances by which we live, and that there would no longer be any humanity or animals on Earth. Well, in the context of a thought experiment like that, the notion of resurrection and timelessness, those notions are strictly to the birds. There's a whole other Proust that I'm in part invoking for you.
Well, if we return to the page about the death of Bergotte, I'm sorry I have it in French in front of me, but we have this, il était mort mort à jamais, qui peut le dire? And then there's a very strange passage where Proust, the narrator, says, il n'y a aucune raison dans nos conditions de vie sur cette terre pour que nous nous croyions obligés de faire le bien, à être délicat, même à être poli, ni pour l'artiste athée à ce qu'il se croit obligé de recommencer 20 fois un morceau dont l'admiration qui l'excitera importera peu à son esprit, mangé par les vers, si il ne fait pas l'hypothèse, Proust says, of another life, anterior or future. So there's a sort of willing suspension of disbelief about another life, previous or future, which is a condition for making art, or even for being good, for doing good. But it's a willing suspension of disbelief, which means that, of course, there can be an apocalypse soon. And the last passage is, de sorte que l'idée que Bergotte n'était pas mort à jamais est sans invraisemblance. So it's wary, but I call it the willing suspension of disbelief, which is the condition for literature and fiction. There wouldn't be any art without this clause.
Thank you. I don't know if we've kind of overrun on the time, Matthias, or...
I think we can conclude, Louise.
Okay,
Thank
do you have any further concluding remarks, or shall we just end on the idea of a willing suspension of disbelief?
I mean, it's the condition of life.
Yes, I think also that Proust essentially does convey life and conscious experience, and that is what makes him so readable and relatable, regardless of the time period in which you're in. So thank you both very much.
Thank you.
And thank you, Matthias, as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.